today with colleagues who are really influential in the world of initial teacher education. We know that there's been a tremendous amount of disruption to everything in our lives, but in terms of training our really valuable, important cohort of new teachers, we've got trainees who stopped their training at Easter, unable to go into summer term teaching practice. We've got issues around placements for September, questions about university provision, school-based provision next year, all kinds of things. But we have the people here today, no pressure team, to answer all these questions and to make us in a position where we can share as much intelligence as we have around what we might do next. And we all know that these are uncertain times, and we're very keen to work together because we believe certainly that that's the way that education is at its best, when we collaborate, when we learn from each other, when we make the best of difficult situations. So I'm delighted to begin the conversation by welcoming Helen Matthews, HMI from Ofsted. She's the Specialist Advisor for Initial Teacher Education, and she's going to give us a few pointers now. So over to you, Helen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, all. I'm hoping that there's going to be a PowerPoint that's going to come up on your screens in a moment. My name's Helen Matthews. I'm one of Her Majesty's Inspectors, and I'm, as I've just been introduced, Specialist Advisor for ITE. I'm looking to Jane now to pass me over. Bear with us, colleagues. That's great. Do you want to move on to the next slide? Is that okay, Jane? So many of you will know that we're currently in the process of launching our new ITV Framework because the previous one came to a close in December 2019. And you know that this framework is very much about putting the curriculum at the heart of everything we do, and aligning it with the school's education inspection framework. And that's been really important to us, that we're looking very much at the quality of the curriculum that's being offered by ITT Providers. Can we move on to the next one, please, Jane? So you will know that between January and April this year, we ran a huge consultation process. I came out and spoke to many of the associations. I spoke to many of you individually. We did face-to-face, and then because of the lockdown, we ended up having to do quite a number of webinars to various associations and groups within ITE. And the consultation itself was very productive, actually, and we had over 300 people respond to the consultation process from all the major associations, but also individuals as well. And actually, you know, very reassuring, trainee teachers and newly qualified teachers also responded to the consultation. Okay, Jane? So these were the 5 areas that we actually consulted on, but we also said that colleagues could also comment on anything else that they felt like commenting on in the handbook, which was quite a brave thing for us to do. But we were genuinely interested in hearing people's views and thoughts about what the new framework might mean for them. These were the 5 actual consultation outcomes, and actually the response was overwhelmingly positive. Over 75%, and in many cases over 80% of people responding to the consultation were incredibly positive about the introduction of these 5 areas, and we were really pleased by that, clearly. However, I'm going to move on to the next slide. There'll be no surprises to know that these were some of the recurring themes that came out the consultation process. And I'm sure, like I said, there's absolutely no surprises here. The first one really was about mentor quality and arrangements. And we've been very, very careful to say throughout this consultation process that what we mean by mentor quality is about the overall mentoring arrangements that you make for your trainee teachers, and that sits at the heart of our leadership and management judgment in the handbook. SSP is still concerning some out there in the sector, and you know that we've been very clear about the fact that SSP is a requirement of the national curriculum and of the teachers' standards and therefore needs to be taught to trainees. We talked about up-to-date evidence, and we've been very clear in our changes to the handbook, and we have made some changes as a response to the consultation. We've changed up-to-date evidence to up-to-date or pertinent research, because we feel actually that covers some of the concerns that colleagues had. And then we've been very clear about when we focus on assessment, we're very clear about what we mean by summative assessment and formative assessment in the handbook. And really, as a result of the consultation, very little has changed in the handbook. However, what we tried to do is bring some clarity where there could have been some interpretation, because we don't like interpretation in Ofsted. It doesn't lead to good, robust judgments being made. So our priorities, that's what I was asked to talk about really, which is my final slide, Jane, is very much around the ITV Framework. We promised you that we would publish this in the summer term. I'm happy to say that the handbook is currently with our proofreaders this week, and it will be published hopefully at the end of this month. It still has to go through various other departments before it can actually be formally published. We are going to be conducting our annual reviews, and I would ask colleagues to please complete those. They haven't gone out yet. We've deliberately kept them back to make sure that they're fit and appropriate in this current climate. And as we've said all along, the framework will commence from September 2020. Now, you know that one of the proposals was that we wouldn't be inspecting until the spring and summer term of every academic year. That means that we won't be inspecting until at least January 2020. At the moment, I know that colleagues will ask me in a moment when we are likely to start inspections. Until the Secretary of State gives the go-ahead for there to be inspections of any provider across the country, I cannot give a definitive answer on that. All I can say is that the framework will be commencing from September 2020 going forward. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. So I think you mean January 2021 would be the first possible time for any inspection, but maybe...
Thank you, yes. September 2020 and January 2021, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Do we have Jim Knight in the building, or are we moving on?
We do.
Aha! Thank you very much. So, Lord Jim, I know you had some problem gaining access to the webinar this morning. I'm sorry about that. Really delighted that you're able to join us. Obviously, a member of the House of Lords, but also Chief Executive, Chief Education and External Officer, sorry, at TES. And we're really looking forward to what you've got to say this morning, Jim. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Alison. Always a delight to see you and to be able to join. I'm sorry I was a little late. We have our morning all-staff meeting that I end up hosting for about 350 people, and it just overran slightly, which was my fault probably. And first thing I want to say is, I know how challenging the last 2 or 3 months has been for ITT providers and for NASBTT, and I totally applaud your efforts and your agility in responding to all of this. Let me then, I guess, just voice a few worries that I have when I'm thinking about how things progress. And some of these, I'm sure, reflect conversations that I've had with Emma and NASBTT and are informed by you and may already have been articulated, I don't know. But I raised a question in the House of Lords virtually. We are managing to do this even in the House of Lords last week with the Minister around induction, where I do have a worry that there's a number of teachers who've been training during this academic year and have been denied for obvious reasons classroom practice. They will then be starting next year in a very weird environment in September, where it's hard for anyone to predict what that will be like. And I have a proper worry about how that induction will go for them and whether they can feasibly get the proper support that they need. The Minister, in her reply, was relying on the Early Careers Framework to provide the reassurance that everything will be okay. I'm not that sure that I think that that's good enough, but we will see. But that's just an indication of some of the things that I think are kicking around as we continue to worry about retention of new trainees and think about what is likely to be a blended learning environment for certainly for the rest of this calendar year. And I'd be surprised if we don't see some of that trickling over through into the rest of the academic year too. And that's a model and a whole bunch of pedagogy that most teachers, be they trainees or otherwise, probably haven't been trained for. And people are making it up on the hoof, and I applaud them for the way that they're managing to do that. But it's really challenging. And there are then some other workforce issues that I'm also worried about, which is, we have seen, understandably, schools recruiting less during the normal peak of the first half of the summer term, and holding back while they wait and see what September looks like. I completely get why they're doing that, but my worry then is you've got a bunch of particularly green, if you like, teachers arriving. You've then got some vacancies that have been carried over, extra use of supply. You've got an unstable or a less stable workforce going into the September start, and then a very active recruitment window in January, while everyone tries to sort of catch up with all of the recruitment consequences of people still retiring at the end of this term and so on and so forth. That also causes me some worry that I think we all have to be alive for. And that just talks to schools' capacity generally for doing ITT during the next academic year, their appetite for taking on trainees in the school-based model. And then universities, as the other big providers, they've got their own problems. They've got massive financial problems with foreign students not coming on, and they are thinking about how to do their own social distancing. Then many of them we've seen aren't that confident with teaching and over technology, and having to come up with their blended learning approach themselves. So they have their challenges too. So I guess there's a bunch of things for us to worry about. And I felt it was worth just articulating in one splurge some of the things that are crossing my mind when I worry about them. But more positively, my sense is, informed by the massive negative of a severe economic recession, what we do see during previous economic recessions is fewer people leaving the profession, more stability in the workforce, and teaching being a more attractive career. We're always going to need teachers. I think there may even be some parents who've enjoyed teaching their children at home who might decide they want to become teachers. And there are a few signs of that, and that offers us some opportunities to recruit some more people into the profession if we can manage that demand with all of the supply worries of training that we've talked about. For TES and TES Institute, so far we've worked pretty hard as one of the few providers that uses blended already and is very comfortable with that offering. So we've done all of our School Direct online interviews online. That's been a huge success. Our online content offer that we made, thanks to NASBTT successfully lobbying government to free up how the training year goes, we've been able to then help a whole bunch of people complete their training during this year. We had 270 providers respond to our free offer of using our content, and 19,000 trainees will be taking advantage of it, which is a significant part of the whole cohort coming through training this year. So we're pleased and proud that we've been able to help. And in that spirit, we are in respect of that induction problem that I talked about earlier, we're also offering online induction as a package to people that covers safeguarding and professional responsibilities and reflective practice and so on. So that's there as an offer in the same spirit as we offered the online content to help people complete their training this year if people want to use it.
Thank you.
In September, we'll also be launching some other things. But the key message around this is around collaboration. And we've been trying to work really hard with NASBTT, with other ITT providers. We want to continue to do that. And this sort of gathering to help that collaboration is really welcome us.
Thank you, and it's great to hear everything that you're doing, and I know that everybody on this webinar will be grateful for that notion of collaboration. I think the other thing to say is that teachers have been beyond brilliant in the last number of weeks and months, and I'm sure that in terms of future recruitment to teaching, there will be lots of people who will be really proud to think about starting a career as a teacher. What an excellent profession. We've really seen our teachers stepping forward. Thank you for your contribution. I'm now going to ask Ruth Talbot to make a few words. Ruth is Deputy Director of the Teaching Workforce Directorate, Train to Teach routes at the Department for Education. Ruth, tell us how things feel from your position. Thank you.
Thank you. So good morning, everybody. Sorry, I'm shuffling slightly out of screen. I am the Deputy Director in charge of Train to Teach. So what that means in practice is that most of initial teacher training policy and delivery comes underneath my umbrella. I'd like to start off by just saying thank you. So we have been working very closely with a number of ITT providers from across the sector to help figure out what to do during this extraordinary time. And I cannot emphasize enough how much we need and value that close relationship with you. And I'd particularly like to say thank you to James and Emma, who have been central in both working with us directly, but also acting as a bridge between the department and ITT providers to help us get that rapid knowledge and insight into what life is actually like trying to deliver ITT at this time and planning for ITT delivery next year. So thank you very much, everybody. Jim made the point about collaboration, and I couldn't echo that more strongly. We do not want to be in a position during this time where we are all working in isolation. We are all working to deliver the same aims, which is to recruit excellent ITT trainees and to deliver the highest quality ITT provision to them. I have been struck in talking to ITT providers how much that emphasis on quality, has resonated. This is not just about trying to cope. This is about making sure that we are still training high quality teachers, because at the end of the day, we still want children to receive that high quality education from those children. What is clear is that the training year next year is going to look like no training year that has existed before. And that's pretty much the only thing that I can say with certainty at this point, that anybody could say with certainty at this point. And that, of course, is the main challenge for next year, which is that uncertainty. We just simply don't know what life is going to look like from September. The key challenge that I see will be how to support everybody through that uncertainty. So trainees, placement schools, and of course people such as yourselves working to deliver high quality ITT. Central to helping to manage that uncertainty will be in thinking in advance what we would do in all of the different possible scenarios that could occur from September. So to me, and this is just me personally, this is not the kind of formal DFE view, but I think everybody would, recognise all of these. To me, the scenarios that we should be thinking about include not all age groups being back in school in September, a second peak during the autumn term or beyond. Schools restricting access to people who are not members of staff. Then there are kind of, variations of those. So all school groups being back, but a week on, a week off, for example. And so it's thinking about how ITT can be delivered in all of those different scenarios. So that has to be challenge one. But then also working with our partners in delivery, so the schools, to agree with them what delivery looks like in those various scenarios and what support the schools will be able to provide and when. And then the kind of third point is about the trainees and communicating to them that, yes, we can't guarantee you what exactly your training will look like next year, but we can guarantee you that it will still be a high quality experience and that you will still come out of the end of it being a fully trained and confident teacher. We are working as quickly as we can to help you in planning for delivery of ITT during the 2021 academic year. I hope that you will all have received the communication about the relaxation of some of the ITT criteria into next year. So that was made towards the end of next week. And so that's particularly around the requirement to have 2 placements, the requirement to cover 4 age groups. We also kind of formally announced, which I think was an open secret, the extension to the time within which candidates are allowed to demonstrate their GCSE equivalency. And we also announced late on Friday the funding for the placements for those people who are training this year who are not on track to achieve QTS by the end of the summer term. There are a variety of other things that we are doing, but I won't go into the detail of those now because I've only got 5 minutes. So the last thing that I'd say is just to please encourage you to all keep on working with us as we go through this period. I can't promise that I will be able to do everything that you asked me for, and indeed I'm certain that I wouldn't be able to, but I will try and do as much as I can.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth. I think that's an incredibly helpful summary of the unknown, but what we're trying to do to respond to that. I'm now going to hand over to Emma Hollis, who you will all know is the Executive Director of NASBTT. Emma, can we hear from you, please?
Sorry, Alison, I was trying to share screen and unmute at the same time and wasn't multitasking very well. Welcome, everybody. We're absolutely thrilled to have so many people here with us. I'm just looking at the numbers. We're at 342 listening in at the moment, panelists. So no pressure. Don't feel overwhelmed or anything. But we genuinely are so pleased to see so many of you joining us. I'm just going to share my screen for my very brief, and it is brief, I promise, Alison. Thoughts on our on what's important for going forward into September 2020 and beyond. 3 simple words I'm going to talk about in where my mind is and where I'm thinking as I'm working with providers, working with colleagues. And the first of those is compassion. Compassion is something that we all have, that we all demonstrate, but is something that's going to need to be at the forefront of our minds more than ever as we go forward into September and beyond. We're going to need compassion for the children that are coming back into our schools who are collectively experiencing something that none of us are able to fully appreciate in terms of the impact that that might have on the children. And in terms of how they're going to come back to school, if and when they can come back to school, the impact that that's going to have on their relationships, both with the adults that are teaching them and other children within the school, the collective trauma that they've experienced, the likelihood of bereavement in their families and extended communities. And that's something that collectively trainee teachers, but also very experienced teachers, are going to have to work together to manage with sympathy and people will be feeling nervous about that. And because of that, we need to also have sympathy for our compassion for our trainees who are going to be entering an unknown world. And trainees going into schools for the first time have all of those feelings anyway. It's the unknown. They're entering a new profession that they're generally very excited about entering. But there is a sense of the unknown, and will they get it right, and what are they facing? And suddenly they're doing that in a period where the unknown is even greater than we've ever seen before. And it's not just unknown in terms of their experience of school, but everybody's experience of school. So the mentors they're working with and are looking to won't have the answers in the same way as they might have had before. And that's not to say that we need to have all the answers, but we do need to be entering into discourse with our trainees, understanding that there is a nervousness, an uncertainty as they go forward into their new careers. I've mentioned the mentors, and we're going to have compassion for our schools. Our schools are having to work in unprecedented and incredibly challenging circumstances. They are being asked to make impossible decisions with a lack of understanding of what the impact might be of their actions. They are fearful for their staff, they are fearful for their children. And we know from our recent survey that as a result of that, many of them are nervous about introducing trainee teachers into their schools. And we've had some comments on the chat about placements in schools being limited, and we're aware that this is going to be an issue certainly early into next year. And so we're going to have to work with our schools compassionately, talk to them about what they can and can't manage, where they can and can't support, and be flexible in our approaches in terms of when we put trainees in school, how we put trainees in school, and how we work with our partners. We're going to need to have compassion for our vulnerable communities. We're aware that ethnic minority groups are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, and we're going to need to think about that when we are making plans to put our trainees and our staff back in school. There's some great resources recently been produced by BayMed in terms of supporting our colleagues from Black and ethnic minority communities that are well worth a read if you haven't already, and they have been shared with members. We're also going to need compassion for each other. We've had a lot of talk already this morning, I'm really pleased to see, about working collaboratively and collegiately. And that involves being aware that not everybody knows the answers, and we're all making decisions not being entirely sure if they're the right decisions. I've seen so much on social media recently, which makes me incredibly sad, which is even when people are trying to reach the same goal, they're bringing each other down and telling each other they're wrong, or they're making the wrong choices, or they're being unkind to one another. And it strikes me that 6 months ago, the trending hashtag was "Be Kind." And I think perhaps we need to bring that back, because we've lost that a little bit in some of the discourse, in some of what we're doing. Let's be compassionate to one another and think about the fact that we're all trying to get to the same shared goal. And finally, some compassion for yourselves. This is a tough time. We're all doing our very best, and we can all feel like we're making the wrong choices or we're doing the wrong thing. But we're all working on this together. We are all here for one another. So take care of yourself. Remember yourself in all of this. And there's some self-care that's needed, as well as care for all of those other people I've mentioned. My second of my 3 words is flexibility. Ruth's already referred to the amount of uncertainty that we've got in front of us, and I think that's absolutely true. In my mind, it's like there's a long path ahead of us that's completely in darkness, and we've got a tiny little flashlight on the back of our phone that we can see a couple of meters in front of us and no further. We can only see the next few steps, and we can only plan for the next few steps. We've already shown as a sector how incredibly agile and innovative we can be. Jim mentioned that in his talk at the beginning, and I have been so impressed by, we reinvented initial teacher training on a weekend's notice. We moved all of our offer online. We suddenly found ways to engage trainees in discussions in different ways. We've been absolutely unbelievably agile and innovative in a very short space of time. And I think there's going to have to be some acceptance, which is incredibly difficult for a sector that is known to be forward thinking and planning all of the time, that there will be lots of unknowns. And we're going to have to be open about that with our trainees And as Ruth quite rightly said, sharing with the trainees, they know they're entering teacher training fully aware of what the world looks like. And we need to share that with them, that we don't have the answers either. And we have, and what we can offer is excellent, high quality teacher training, but it may look different. And we're going to have to be agile and innovative as to what that looks like as time goes through. And my final word is trust. And I've mentioned that trainees are applying to us in full knowledge of what the world looks like, and they are placing so much trust in us by applying to us now in such an uncertain world. They're placing trust in us to get them through when they don't know whether they're going to be in school in September or October or November, or when they're going to be in school. They don't know which children they're going to be teaching. They don't know which whether they're going to be teaching online or in person, and yet they're trusting us. And I think that speaks volumes for the sector in terms of how people view us, and that they are still making those decisions to apply and to enter the profession.
Thank you so much, Emma. Your points there are really relevant and important. We've got a bit more time at the end when we've got some questions, when perhaps we'll come back to you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I need us to move on to listening to the wonderful Sam Twistleton. She's the Director of Sheffield Institute of Education and the Chair of the DFE ITT Content Group. Sam, are you with us for the next part of our webinar, please?
I am. I'm waiting for my screen to be shared. And while I wait, I'm just going to say how annoying it is to go on after Emma when you've got a short amount of time, because she always says what I'm going to say, but so much better. So in my head, I'm thinking, oh, how do I rejig it? Because really many of the same messages, although I'm actually going to start from a slightly different starting point. So if we can go on to that second slide, please. Which doesn't matter that hopefully you'll agree, it doesn't matter you can't properly read this. What I really want to do is take a step back from COVID for a minute and say something specifically about the ITT Core Content Framework, which has been the thing obviously that I've been living and breathing for over a year now. There's been a lot of talk about should we delay this by a year, and I just want to sort of strongly suggest that we shouldn't, but then the reason why you've got this lens superimposed over this slide is to say we do need to see it through a different lens. But I just want to remind, if you go on to the next slide, I just want to remind people why we thought it was a good idea. First of all, to have a teacher recruitment and retention strategy, which then gave birth to the Early Career Framework, which then gave birth to the ITT Core Content Framework. And you know, that dates back a couple of years now, in terms of the DFE recognising that we have a big problem with teacher retention, which is in itself causing problems with the need to recruit more teachers. And it's a problem which is getting worse, nothing to do with COVID. And it's a problem which is getting earlier every year. So we lose more teachers every year, and we lose them earlier in the profession every year. And the recruitment and retention strategy is a response. It's got lots of different excellent things, different working parts, all of which kind of move together. But the two I really want to focus on and remind ourselves of are the Early Career Framework and the ITT Core Content Framework. And when the two are up and working and running together, we have something which could make such a huge difference here, which is this entitlement for all trainees, regardless of where they train in the country and where they get their first job in the country, of this velcroed together set of frameworks, which provides a kind of consistency in terms of what they have at the beginning and then what they have the first 2 years after they've qualified. And we need that now as much as we did pre-COVID. In fact, we need it more than ever, because we need to support our early career teachers. That's one of the reasons why they're leaving, is because they haven't had that support, and we do need to support them. If you can just move on to the final slide, this is where there's an awful lot of overlap with some of the things that Emma was saying. So what's the lens that we need to look at this from September onwards in terms of IT? By the way, I do agree with a lot of what Jim said in terms of next year's NQTs and our thoughts about them, but I haven't addressed those here. I'm thinking particularly about next year's ITE. And I think the emphasis that we need to put on in how we address the sort of challenges that are going to be in front of us, I think the core content framework helps, but we need to see it through the lens of the importance of relationships and everything that Emma just said. Relationships with children, with all the different staff in school, with parents, with tutors, and so on. And the fact that all of us have been dealing with trauma, and that trauma will be present and ongoing in the autumn. And it's obviously trauma of the kind that Emma just described in terms of bereavement and so on, but it's also going to be an awful lot of economic trauma as well. I'm the deputy chair of the Doncaster Opportunity Area, and in Doncaster we're already seeing, you know, massive impact of people losing their jobs and the impact that then has on their lives, their communities and their children. So the importance of really focusing on how we develop those relationships, how we support our trainees to develop those relationships is going to be, you know, probably the most important thing. But actually, I think that's actually a really positive benefit. If that's our number one thing that we're focusing on, all of us collectively in that collaboration that we all talked about, that is a really important identity forming way of coming into the profession. Because without those relationships and without that understanding of all the different factors that impact on children's ability to learn, we can't overcome all the barriers that come with them. And the fact that trainees will be entering at a point where that's front and centre in everybody's mind, I think it's actually a really positive thing. As providers and as school partners, as again, many have said already, what school looks like is going to be quite different. And probably throughout most of next year, if not all of next year. What I would really, really caution against, and this is the message to schools more than anything, is thinking, well, let's just put off getting trainees into school. I think that would be a wrong thing to do. I understand the temptation because there's so many logistical challenges and so many other priorities that schools must feel like they're grappling with. But the trainees can actually be part of the solution to some of those problems. Somebody wrote a really good blog about this that I read yesterday. They offer extra pairs of hands who care, who want to get involved, who can work with small groups, who could maybe spend a day in school on that kind of, you know, day in, day out, or week in, week out model that Ruth mentioned, and then continue to follow up with those children remotely. I think that's a fantastic opportunity for trainees. They can learn a lot from that, but it's also extra resource for schools. So please, can we see trainees as part of the solution, and see getting them into school, even if it's for less time and even if it's in a more hybrid way, where there's kind of remote follow-up, as being a really great way of actually addressing the challenges that are going to be there. They can do focused interventions and so on. Sorry, am I going on too long?
Thank you, Sam. No, I think your point is very well made about the importance of trainees being able to have really high quality placements, and us making sure that in everything else that schools are open to new solutions. And one of the things that we can do is to encourage those placements, because as you say, it provides another pair of hands or several pairs of hands that can help with supporting our students. If we move on now, thank you very much, Sam. If we move on now to Professor John Howson, who is the chairman at TeachVac and TeachVac Global, who knows everything there is to know about teacher vacancies and recruitment. John, can we come to you, please?
Thank you very much, Alice. And there will be some slides coming up, which I hope Emma will be able to share with us all. I just want to say that I'm overawed by the content we've had so far, and just a couple of observations outside of the data. I do wonder whether or not those trainees finishing this year that can't get jobs, we can try and think about some sort of supernumerary scheme to do exactly what Sam was talking about, to make sure that they can get into schools and practice what they've started learning during what has been a truncated year. But if we can move on to the next slide, there are two slides here. The first one looking at our analysis of applications by postgraduates to train as teachers. As soon as lockdown occurred, applications for primary courses went up by 15,000 in a month, and have taken us back to roughly where we were in 2016-17, after a number of years where the application rate had been declining. That, I suspect, will be affecting a number of people who've still got open courses much more than anybody who's got closed courses, who presumably won't be receiving those. We didn't see, if we move on to the next slide, anything like the same increase in applications for secondary. And I wonder whether that's because some people are thinking that primary school teachers only deal with one class most of the time, and therefore a smaller group of children, where the secondary teachers deal with a much larger cohort of children, and have been taking on board what ONS have been saying about the risk profile of teaching. But what we have seen in some subjects was a significant increase in the number of offers in terms of placed candidates, conditionally placed, or those holding offers. And that's just an example of what's happened in English to show the rise over the last couple of months there. If we move on to tracking vacancies, primary was pretty well having the same sort of year as the last couple of years in the first 3 months of 2020. We know that probably in the sector as a whole, the number of children leaving for secondary is not yet now being balanced by the number coming in at the other end. There was a sharp drop as soon as lockdown occurred, and a slight increase in April over March, but still significantly lower than the peak of the previous 2 years. If we move on to the next slide, which shows the same thing in secondary, secondary was having a good year up until mid-March. It was ahead, as far as we were concerned, in terms of the number of vacancies we tracked over the last 2 years, and then it just dropped like a stone. And in May, significantly, about 4,000 vacancies less than we tracked in May last year. That's pretty well across all subjects and all parts of the country, although London and the home counties seem to have been affected worse than some of the areas further north. So we've tracked that in detail in the subjects in the next slide, which I'm not going to go through now, but you'll get the slides afterwards so you can look at it at your leisure. But just to say that English was one of the subjects where we'd seen one of the highest levels of decline in April, May, and interestingly at the other end, music, despite what everybody says about the arts in schools, was one of the subject areas where we'd actually seen one of the smallest declines, perhaps because it was already declined last year. If we move on to the next slide, we estimate, looking at the vacancies this year, and a crude normal assumption on how many of the main scale vacancies go to people coming out of training, what the state of play is in the subject. And as I said, because we'd had a very good year for secondary in January and February and early March, we were thinking that the figures suggest that across the year as a whole, some subject schools are still going to find it difficult to recruit trainees. But at the other end of the scale, history trainees are going to find it really difficult to find a job. What we don't know, which Jim alluded to, is how many returners there will be who have been furloughed or made redundant. We do know that in the recession in the latter part of the first decade of this century, when we had figures from what were then the General Teaching Council, in 1 year, something like 30,000 people renewed their membership with the General Teaching Council after the recession hit. In practice, that recession didn't create a lot of unemployment, so most of them, I don't think, came in. But it did mean that there were a couple of years where trainees and returners were scrambling for the same jobs. And I think that's what's going to be happening probably to an even greater degree if we see a very large spike in permanent unemployment, and lots of teachers trying to come back into the profession and competing for jobs. And we are trying to do something during that period. I used to hold, in those days it was more face-to-face seminars, but now we've restarted webinars for helping people understand about the best way of tackling the job application and the new world of online interviews, which many of them were facing rather than the old-fashioned interview process. But it is going to be a difficult time. I agree with everything everybody said about next year. I think we will see quite a lot more people looking as teaching as a potential career, because if there is this spike in unemployment graduates, we'll see this as potentially one of those areas where there will be jobs in the public sector. And that's really all I want to say at this particular moment in time.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Really, really helpful, and of course very challenging times, as we've all been saying. Although, just to pick up on a comment in the chat, you know, I really want to emphasise the importance of expertise and the highest quality colleagues working within our schools across our profession, and just maybe where we were looking before all these unexpected circumstances in shortages. Maybe now, you know, we have an opportunity to make sure that the very best people are working with our children and ensuring the best quality education. I've got James Noble-Rogers now. Thank you, James, who comes to us as Executive Director from USET. James, what's your take on all of this? Are you with us, James?
Sorry, I was muted. So if we could just have my slides up, I'm afraid I don't have the skills to organise them from here. Okay, very, very pleased to be here. This is quite an innovative event, the first one of its kind I've actually spoken at, and thank you very much to NASBTT for organising it. If we move on to the first slide. I mean, that's just a brief preamble about what USET does. I think most colleagues here are probably familiar with this. So if we move on to the next slide. So the context that we're going to be working with, and because I'm towards the end, a lot of colleagues have made these points very well indeed, but student teachers and NQTs next year are going to be faced with some very unique and challenging circumstances. There's likely to be behaviour issues and socialisation issues of children in school who missed out on a big chunk of their school experience in some cases, and there'll be very sad issues to do with both pupils and student teachers themselves and their colleagues having experienced bereavement issues because of what we've been going through recently. Another big context, as John and others have just mentioned, is applications to ITE programs are significantly up for the first time in many years, and that's obviously linked to the likelihood of a forthcoming recession. But at the same time as applications to ITE programs are going up, we are faced, as people have noticed, the likely shortage and the difficulty of securing placements for student teachers in schools. I mean, we're already faced with placement difficulties before the pandemic, and these have just been made worse. And the figures I'm going to quote are from a survey that NASBTT very helpfully launched, to which both SCITS and HEI providers responded. 124 ITE providers have reported that they anticipate losing at least some of their partner schools in September 2020 onwards. 81% of providers are concerned about placements, and this is the most worrying statistic. 45% of providers were reporting either closing or thinking of closing recruitment because of placement difficulties. And that is very sad, because to some extent it could potentially limit our opportunity to capitalise on the increase in applications which we've seen. If we could have the next slide, please. So the number one priority for the ITE sector from September 2020, we have to meet the unique needs of student teachers, partner schools and their learners. And that has to be done by continuing to provide high quality and relevant teacher education programs, We'll have to provide bespoke and tailored support for student teachers and the schools who we work with. There'll be a need to redesign programs. There's going to be more blended learning and more online delivery, particularly at the first part of the academic year, and that could involve the rescheduling some of student teacher placements. We're going to have to develop innovative partnerships and placement opportunities, and we are going to have to try and recruit as many high quality applicants to the teaching profession as we possibly can. This is going to require a lot of reprioritisation by ITV providers. Some important activities which were going to be priorities next year will have to be not abandoned but deprioritised so we can meet the immediate needs the sector's faced with. To have the next slide, please. So immediate solutions that could be done to address these issues. Firstly, extend relaxation of the ITE requirements into 2021 to maximise placement opportunities and allow partnerships to respond flexibly to local needs. We know there was already flexibility built into the system in respect of the number of days student teachers have to spend in school, but we're very pleased and well done to DFE for extending a lot of the other flexibilities into 2021. I mean, we've had an extremely good dialogue with colleagues from DFE throughout this and a productive working relationship, and absolutely give credit where it's due to DFE. We must do more to encourage schools to participate in initial teacher education. Again, other colleagues, Sam has mentioned this. DFE could have a role to play in pointing out and making explicit the benefits to schools of being part of ITE partnerships. And I also think Ofsted could have a role. We've long suggested that one of the criteria for a school being graded outstanding is that it demonstrates a commitment to developing the next generation of new teachers. Now, I'm going to disagree with what Sam said here and take issue partly with what Helen said. I think that we need to delay the formal introduction of the ITT Core Content Framework and the new inspection framework by 12 months, or at the very least treat 2021 as a transition year so that providers and their partner schools can implement the CCF properly and effectively and not rush it, and we can plan for the introduction of the new inspection framework over a longer period. I think ITE partnerships have a moral obligation at the moment to prioritise the needs of students, schools and pupils above compliance issues. I take the point that aspects of the CCF will support student teachers and support schools, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect ITE providers to focus on that at the moment. I mean, that might be a bit controversial, but that is what we would be calling for. We have, with NASBTT, been asking for financial support to be provided for students who weren't deemed to be on a trajectory to be awarded QTS this year. We're very, very pleased that the DFE has announced financial support for that. I got the message on Saturday and we got it straight round to our member institutions. So again, thank you and well done to DFE for that. And finally, we need funded early professional development for all newly qualified teachers who qualified this year and are going into schools as NQTs this coming September. Again, the ECF has huge strengths and some of this support might be built on the early career framework, but I think firstly, money needs to be made available, resources need to be made available beyond just the pilot areas, and the ECF to some extent will need to be flexed, because when it was written, it wasn't written with a view to the needs that NQTs and their pupils in schools will have next year. So move on. In the longer term, I think there was anyway, and I think more so now, I think there's a need to develop a cross-sector consensus on teacher education. I think people from across the sector, from the teacher unions, the representatives of the head teacher associations, the professional associations, the chartered college, the subject associations, it would be helpful if we could all get together to discuss in depth the priorities for teacher education, how ITE should be structured and what the content should be in the context of the core content framework. We're not talking about replacing that, but in the context of the core content framework, and talk about how different sectors can work together. So how SCITs, HEIs and schools and other organisations work more effectively together. And we are hoping to encourage the establishment of a cross-sector group which will cover the whole of the UK to take that forward. So that's all I've said. And there's my contact details if people want me.
Thank you very much, James. And certainly I know the Chartered College will be very happy to engage with you in that group should you wish us to do so. We've got our last participant now, and then we've got some space for some questions, and maybe that issue around Ofsted during 2021 will come up during the questions. But before that, we have the lovely Sinead McBrearty, who is Chief Executive of Education Support. Sinead, what have you got to say to us this morning?
Thank you, Alison. I'm so sad to say that I haven't brought a presentation because I'm missing the opportunity to say next slide, please, as though I was at a government press briefing, but I'll have to cope with that and get on. There are three main points I want to make, Alison. The first is around perspective. Colleagues have talked about the change in context and what's going on, and we know that there's heightened concern about the learning gap and the implications that that will have for everybody working in schools, including those on placement. Also, there are issues, not just children returning with trauma, loss, bereavement experience, but there's going to be another cohort of children who will return somewhat unhappily because they've been quite content working at home at their own pace, well-resourced and well-supported. And it's going to be very difficult, I think, to manage that spectrum of experience in a classroom for experienced teachers, let alone for trainees. So I think that context has a lot of different elements to it, but I think unevenness will be a major feature of the new academic year, and that will affect those on placement. I think in that sense of holding perspective, we need to recognise and be attentive to all of the responses that people, including ourselves, will have over the coming period of time, and to accept that performance, in inverted commas, will be affected. It is very interesting to me how quickly people forget that this is an extraordinary period of time, and there are extraordinary events and changes happening, and we normalise, and that's right and good and proper. That's what we do psychologically to allow ourselves to cope and get through. But we need to remember that our expectations do need to be adjusted. And so holding perspective, I think, is critical for everybody as they try to do what they can at this time. The second point is around refreshing support for mentors. We know from the literature that relationships and collegiality are critical and sit at the heart of teacher resilience. Mentors need to be supported to attend to trainees as a core function of their role. When we have mentors who are also teaching, and now teaching on physical sites as well as maintaining online learning resources stretched to capacity, this becomes a very difficult proposition, if not unrealistic. So I think we need to rethink that, and whether that's through protecting time for mentors, whether there are opportunities to involve people who need to continue to self-isolate or distance or cocoon in taking some aspect of mentoring support. There are ways in which we need to be creative and think about how this situation affects the workforce and how we can channel the talent of the workforce in different directions to support what we're trying to do. And I suppose the final point in supporting mentors is the context is evolving. So mentoring will be different at this time. The response of people on placement to their expectations and how they've been met will change, and there's a variety of new challenges that mentors are going to need specific support with. So hold perspective, refresh the support for mentors, and the final one, obviously coming from a mental health perspective, is of course to refresh the support for trainees themselves. In this context, there's a lot of uncertainty and unfamiliarity. That causes anxiety. This is not news to anyone. Normalising what's happening and supporting trustees through that process, including them in all school conversations around how at an institutional level school communities are coping, is really, really important. The fact is that no one will know where the kids are when they come back in September, because there's going to be extremes in every class. And to that extent, everyone is a trainee to some extent next year. Everybody's going to be learning. And I think for schools, there is a fantastic opportunity, though it is going to require yet more from our school leaders, but to redefine school cultures, to rethink them in the light of the learning from the shock to the system we've had. But that context is really important. There are issues that, in terms of supporting trustees, we have work to do around understanding vulnerability. This might be something, Emma, that we can pick up, but whether there's a role for negotiating with schools how certain placements can be carried out, trying to find a way to keep people safe and to do remote working where possible, but to still get their teaching practice, but perhaps not in the same classroom setting as they might have imagined that they would. We need to start thinking through strategies and developing this at pace, I think. The other piece around supporting those on placement is around clarity of expectations. The system cannot absorb the shock of the pandemic and keep everything else constant. It's just not, that's not possible. Something has to give. So we need to be really clear about what is required and what's not required. We need to make sure we don't leave people, particularly on placement, with too much to figure out. You know, if you've had a lot of learning about how to engage students and do pair work and do group work, and that stuff's not an option, you need real hands-on support around what the right alternatives are that you should be trying. So it's really practical stuff. Focusing on relationships, beyond mentors, building support networks across the school if that's where somebody's based, ideally at the same phase level, and also across the training cohort. The really practical help from people in schools can alleviate stress and pressure in like nothing else. You know, my sister tells a great story when she retrained a couple of years ago as a primary school teacher, and the first time she was on her own setting up an art class for 6-year-olds, and it was it was just bedlam, as she had 36-year-olds wandering around armed with art material. And her point was, nobody told me. Nobody told me this would be chaotic. And it's amazing the difference that very small pieces of practical information can make. That's real support for people stepping into the roles, particularly now. Advising trainees to think about where they get their support. WhatsApp groups are great and can be fantastic, but can also be a forum for oversharing. They can engender more pressure. So bilateral support, one-to-one support, small group chats, very important. And I think most importantly, helping trainees think about how they build their connection with their pupils. That's going to be very tough in a socially distant context. And so any strategies that we can offer to help those on placement to do that as quickly and as effectively as they can is going to be very important. And my final point on supporting those who are training is I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to go back and look at how we teach people to not only give, but to receive feedback. I think feedback is going to be really critical at this juncture, because the normal sources of feedback from students in the normal way, from parents in the normal way, will be affected by the situation we're in. And so it's really important that our trainees are equipped to hear feedback in a really constructive way and to be able to learn from it and not feel judged and not feel even more remote and more distant in what's a socially distant context to operate in anyway. So I think those are all really important things that we can do to support those who are training to be teachers, whilst also giving them good content on mental health, hygiene, all the stuff that is going to keep them safe and well, from the obvious eating well and exercising through to self-care, accepting uncertainty, recognizing that distress is unnormal in this situation to some extent, or what the trauma that they experience when they come back. But relationships are at the heart of all of this, and I think collegiality, a really strong sense of purpose, clarity about how important education is. There are real opportunities here to make this a point of inflection, a turning point in the profession for the better.
Thank you so much, Sinead. And there's so much in what you say and what others have said so far this morning that is about leadership. We need our colleagues on this call and attending this webinar. All of us need to be leaders, because we need to be helping other people to come to terms with the unexplainable. We need to be calm. We need to be able to move forward in a way that enables everyone to achieve as much success as they possibly can. But I would question whether within that we also need to feel the challenges of inspection. So we've only got a few moments left, a few minutes left. So I'm going to come, Helen, to you, if I may. What about this challenge that James Noble Rogers has given this morning, that says maybe we should have 2021 should be a year of consolidation and transition, rather than one where we would expect the new inspection framework to start after Christmas? What would your response be to that, Helen?
I think we have to be several things really, and one of the things that Sinead just said is about the extraordinary times that we find ourselves in, and I think the first thing to say is that often we sort of group Ofsted as this sort of separate entity, don't we? But actually, you know, my HMI workforce, we're all going through the same extraordinary times as everybody else is, and we've got absolute empathy with what's going on, because we're all ex-head teachers, partnership leaders, etc., etc. So we know what it's like. We've got friends and colleagues that are going through it at the moment. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that there seems to be we need to be very clear that the core content framework is a Department for Education expectation. It's a minimum expectation that is expected of partnerships that's going to be rolled out from September. And Ofsted, the new Ofsted framework, clearly one of the things that we are doing is to check whether or not that's actually being rolled out effectively, and whether partnerships are meeting that entitlement, which is the DFE's entitlement. But clearly also within Ofsted, it's more than that. And I talked about the curriculum sitting at the heart of everything that we do. Now, we don't have the powers in Ofsted to determine when we decide to inspect or not. That's the Secretary of State who has the power to determine when inspections will start again. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say really is that what we have thought about introducing, we are going to introduce, as a transition statement for the next academic year, which will talk very much, and the two words I think are really clear here. One is about the ambition of the ITT curriculum. You know, what does that curriculum look like for trainees? How ambitious is it? But recognising quite clearly that over the next year, you know, if we do come in and inspect partnerships in the next year, and I use the term if, because like, you know, people have said throughout this call, none of us know, we're all moving into the unknown. We're on Emma's dark lane, aren't we, with our spotlight, trying to see where we're going next. If we come in and when we come in to inspect, clearly what we want to do is for partnership leaders to articulate to us what this ambitious curriculum of theirs looks like in whatever form, but clearly also explain to us why delivery of that ambitious curriculum may not have gone to plan this year because of all the things that colleagues have talked about on this call. And I think that's really important that we keep that in mind, that, you know, we know that practically there will be things that you would like your trainees to be able to do, which you're not then going to be able to deliver on, okay? And that will be taken into consideration.
Okay, so thank you very much. And assuming that Ofsted were to still be coming in, it may well be, and I'm trying not to put words in your mouth, but it may well be that it's a much less about judgment and much more about sharing ways of working that are happening across the country, because Ofsted's in a very good position to be able to share expertise and knowledge. And certainly one of the things that I very much hope they will be considering in terms of school inspections is that this is a time to share knowledge about what's working well. And it's only in a very few cases that where maybe safeguarding is an issue that there needs to be real flags raised. But yeah, you're not shaking your head, so maybe that means.
Well, I can't tell you, I spend inordinate amounts of my time currently in what we call lovingly business as usual meetings, which is about, you know, what's it going to look like next month, what's it going to look like the month after, what's it going to look like the month after that. And clearly across different remits, because we inspect the whole range of remits out there, and some remits are very regulatory, some are about safeguarding, and some are, you know, about judgments. The ITV Framework, you know, it will be launched in September 2020, because that's what we've been saying. You know, pre-COVID, we said it was going to be launched. It's going to be launched. You know, we are privy to the Secretary of State. When the Secretary of State explains that we start inspections again, that's the time when we start to think about what that might look like. Okay. And we, you know, we're working, you know, Ruth's on the call, we work very closely with the Department for Education team, and they're very clear, you know, that the CCF will be launched by them in September, and that we will launch our framework.
Thank you, Helen. So let me come to Ruth. Can I come to you and gain your perspective on timescales? And, you know, I think what we've seen throughout this webinar is that people are very appreciative of the DFE's willingness to work in partnership with organisations like USET and NASBTT. That's brilliant. What do you think about this issue around the inspection next year? Is that something that might have some flex in it?
You know, what I'd say is that, and that I hope was clear when I was talking, is that we are very much alive to the disruption that the pandemic has caused. You know, Helen mentioned how closely we are working together. I set out when I spoke, you know, what we are seeking to achieve, which, you know, I don't think anybody in the sector would argue is the same thing that they're trying to achieve, which is, you know, high quality trainees to be recruited and then trained next year. So, you know, we are listening to the sector, but at this point in time, people should carry on planning for implementation of the core content framework from September.
Okay, thank you very much. That's been really helpful. Just finally, because we're running out of time, are you still on the call, Jim? Just wonder.
I am.
Thank you. I just wonder, you know, this morning it was announced that children will not be returning to primary school this term, apart from the children that are already there, the children in reception year 1, year 6 and key workers children. Do you think it's time for a digital strategy related to access for children across all age ranges, so that they can begin to really access the curriculum in homes where perhaps they don't have devices that they can use?
Very strongly, I do agree that we need that strategy. I think you know, heads are in a really difficult position. They need the leadership that would offer and the guidance that would offer. And you know, this isn't about there being some kind of ed tech silver bullet that can replace teachers at all. This is about, you know, there's some basic technology that, you know, I use every day in my work at the moment, you know, video conferencing and various other platforms. They're not necessarily education specific, but there are some really good education specific tools out there, you know, the Google Classroom, the Google G Suite, Microsoft 365 and SharePoint and so on. Those are just basic infrastructure. What we need is the training and the pedagogy as to how you might use some of those platforms. Some guidance around what is safe in terms of the use of video if you are teaching remotely. I suspect we need a dedicated inset day in order to be able to roll out some proper training. But that needs to be commissioned really fast, using some of the expertise from a few, you know, who I know, you know, I'm sure there are plenty, but there are a few that I know of who are doing some good work with live lessons. There are others doing some good work with recorded lessons. But we need to get to a more differentiated offer than just broadcasting learning, which is the understandable and perfectly reasonable response that we've had with the BBC and with the Oak National Academy, and the ability for schools to engage more directly with children individually and in classes, and bring them together as communities, while some of them are remote and some of them are in school.
Yes, thank you. I mean, it's such a huge challenge, and I was just hearing last week of families where there's one mobile phone between the whole family and that's the only connection they have. So the challenge for our sector in terms of delivering remote learning when you can't do it digitally is extreme. But I'm sure you would agree, our teachers are really stepping forward at this moment. And I think the fact that we've had such positive statistics given to us by John Howson related to the numbers of teachers or potential teachers who want to come and join us and people who are staying. Hopefully this is all very, very good news for our profession. We've covered a lot of topics this morning, colleagues, and I appreciate from questions in the chat and so on that there is still a lot more that we could talk about, but we agreed that we would finish at 11:45. So I'm going to bring this session to a close, but just to say a huge thank you to NASBTT and to UCIT and to everybody who has participated in this online session. I hope very much that it's been useful to you if you're listening. And let's continue the conversation, because all of us in this realm are dedicated to providing the best possible start for our teachers, and then the best possible career once they join our profession. So thank you very much indeed to everyone for joining us this morning. It's been wonderful to be here. Thank you.
And thank you, Alison.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.